Welcome to Studio 21. For the next half hour, we're going to be continuing our discussion with Associate Professor Ken Blankemeyer, and it's going to be focusing on that year right before Abraham Lincoln became president. Dr. Blankemeyer is also very much involved with a sesquicentennial lecture series that we've been airing on 21, and if you can't make those lectures in person, go ahead and tune into our station for that, please. Dr. Blankemeyer, thanks so much for joining us again.
Glad to be here.
And we really didn't focus on Abraham Lincoln in our last discussion about that time, right before the Civil War. How long had Abraham Lincoln been running for president?
Probably his whole life, but he wasn't, let's say, a spectacular politician before he got the nomination. He had 4 terms in the Illinois State Legislature, 1 term in the U.S. House of Representatives, although he had run for other things and really hadn't made much of a political career. However, he was one of the most highly paid lawyers in Illinois.
He was essentially a corporate attorney for
he
that
was
decade
for the Illinois
before president.
Central and some other large firms, but yet he still kept his, let's say, rural personality. And so he had a very, well, let me back up. Most people think of Abraham Lincoln in terms of Gregory Peck, 77 years ago. But he had, by all reports, a very high, squeaky voice and a very rural accent. So he really sounded like this. And this, of course, is not good for the movies, but this is his persona,
Well,
and he never dropped it.
There's a persona, and it's a way of marketing yourself. And
Yeah.
Marketing today, we use the internet, we use radio, we use television, social networking. That didn't exist back then.
No.
He, in terms of his persona and his development, you talk about his legislative career, state legislative career. At one time, he jumped out of a state house window to miss a vote because he didn't want to be involved in that.
That wasn't uncommon back then. These times, if we went back in a time machine, would be very strange to us. They had no TV, radio. Mass newspapers were just getting started. There were plenty of newspapers, but they were usually local. The big circulation newspapers didn't quite exist. They didn't have a lot of illustrations. These had to be hand-drawn. And one of the major forms of entertainment for people was to listen to political speeches, which might go on 3 or 4 hours. Now, most of us would be horrified at the idea of standing in the hot sun in some, summer and listening to 4 hours of a political speech, but this is what they did. And
well, that was part of the first national images of Abraham Lincoln were the famous debates with Stephen Douglas.
That's
for
true.
The Senate.
The whole issue after the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the issue in Kansas and the coming to a head of the issue of slavery made those debates very interesting to the rest of the country because Douglas was laying out his popular sovereignty doctrine and Lincoln was staunchly opposed to the spread of slavery. He had always said he had no intention of interfering with slavery in the states that it existed, but they didn't want it to spread to the north, and they didn't want it in, as they called it, the territories, which Kansas at that time was, as was Oklahoma and everything west. And the hashing out of these issues was closely followed. There were only 7 debates, by the way. But this was closely followed by the national press.
Those are Senate debates then?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you have to realize that the Senate, senators were elected by the state representatives.
The legislature.
The legislator. And so what was going on here was Lincoln and Douglas were running to get votes for the state legislatures who would then vote for them. And the direct elections didn't occur till the 20th century. And so the idea is that if I can be popular enough, people will vote for the state legislature in my party, we'll have a majority, I will be elected senator. And it was a very close election. In fact, Lincoln really got more popular votes if you count up the votes for the state legislatures. But as often happens, there were more Democratic state legislators elected as opposed to Republicans. So Douglas retained his seat in the Senate, and Lincoln lost. However, he became a national figure because of this. And
How were the debates reported? I mean, we didn't have TV, we didn't have radio.
you had local reporters who would go and listen to this, distill it, oftentimes would bias it in favor of their candidate. The newspapers at the time were largely owned by individuals who were not trying to make money. They were trying to influence opinion. And so if I was let's say, a politician of means, I might buy a newspaper and then have them cover me and, of course, make me look good. So reporters would follow these debates, which oftentimes had somewhere between 5,000 to 10,000 people who would listen to this. And they would report on what was being said. And since the issues were so important for the country, the whole country was watching. That's why these debates are so famous even to this day.
Now, you talk about 5,000 to 10,000 people listening to a debate. Did Lincoln's voice help in that sense because of how it could carry?
Well, you had to, if you were going to address that number of people, you had to project. And so these people would almost be like stage actors. They would actually practice to project their voice so people could hear. Whether it helped or not is hard to say, but he was addressing people in Illinois who were rural like him, and so they wouldn't have thought his accent strange or his manners strange, although a lot of reports do point out that he was a lanky, gawky guy who perhaps didn't project the dignity that people were used to with politicians, whereas Douglas, who was very short, had practiced for years in looking the part. And even though he looked the part, Lincoln was a very intelligent person, maybe one of the most intelligent people we've ever had for president. And he could think on his feet. He could tell a good story, get people loosened up. And so he was a very worthy opponent for Douglas, plus his positions were well thought out.
Well, in a live performance, and if you study theater, you know over time that the leading men were always the taller guys. You got Douglas, who's about a little over 5 feet tall, and then you got 6'4" Abraham Lincoln. In a crowd, he would stand out.
He would, but the platform would be elevated so everybody could see Douglas. And of course, Lincoln being rather spectacular looking. I mean, you have to realize he's 6'4", he weighs 180 pounds. And he's, the average height in these days was about 5'7". So he would be, today, you'd have to have somebody that was 6'10", and weigh maybe 200 pounds to look like Lincoln looked to those people. Plus, he didn't grow his beard until after he won the nomination, so he had a very angular face. He wasn't attractive, and yeah, he would draw attention. But people listened back then more than they do now.
The two factors I wanted to get into. I understand he wrote a lot of letters to the editor, many of them or most of them anonymous?
Oftentimes politicians would write letters to newspapers anonymously, praising themselves, which still may happen today. We don't know, but usually you have some staff member that would do it. But yeah, that was oftentimes done.
But really, to understand Abraham Lincoln, I think you have to look at the fact that he was very much a political operative for decades.
He was. He was very heavily involved in Illinois state politics, although he didn't hold a lot of offices. He really liked politics. He wanted to be elected to something, and eventually he was.
Now, he advocated for a lot of candidates, actually ran some campaigns for candidates, kind of orchestrated it, figured out which buttons to push back in those days. This year, we go from March 1860, it's a year before he was sworn into office. He was 51 years old. What's happening in that period of time? What's he doing to become president of the United States?
Well, pretty much at that point just sitting back because the Republican Party, which by the way had only existed for 4 years at the time, and this was their second presidential election, had some leading candidates, William Seward and Chase from Ohio, who eventually, Seward became Secretary of State and Chase became the Secretary of Treasury. And his favorite color was green. And when we decided to have paper money, that's where greenbacks come from. He decided they were going to be green. But anyway, these people were leading national figures. And there were a few others. But in essence, all of these people, being in politics for a long time, had lots of political enemies. Lincoln was relatively unknown. And so ultimately the election pivots on Lincoln being put forth as the acceptable candidate.
Now, there was an initial state convention in Illinois, in Decatur, before the national convention for the Republicans. And that's a key. I mean, he has to become a favorite son in order to even get into the race and be considered seriously.
He was very popular in Illinois, and the favorite son phenomena is still occurs today, where if you have a popular politician in the state, then the delegation will be committed to vote for that person just because they're the favorite son. But the idea is that they're probably not going to win the whole bag. But what this allowed Lincoln's candidacy to do was to raise its profile. The convention was in Chicago, so they could pack the convention hall, which back then you didn't know who was going to win until the convention decided that, whereas today, you know, months before the convention, who's going to win the election.
Now, the convention being in Chicago, was that a major factor? Could Lincoln have gotten it if that convention was in New York or in Cincinnati?
If it had been in New York or Cincinnati, the chances would have been much slimmer. And actually, one of the techniques that was used to pack the hall with Lincoln's supporters is that a hall, of course, has only so many seats, and so they printed up tickets. Lincoln's supporters printed up duplicate tickets and got there earlier.
You're saying Honest Abe?
Well, he didn't do it himself. I'm sure it was some functionary. But this was done. They printed up duplicate tickets and then got there before the other guys did, and so they had the seats. And the idea was, since this was not a foregone conclusion, you get enough people in that hall and you generate enthusiasm, your candidate is going to benefit from that. And so they did these kinds of tricks that are still done today. Barry Goldwater's people in '64 were ready to cut communication cables if they needed to, which is actually vandalism. I don't know what kind of laws were broken by printing up duplicate tickets, but I'm sure there were some. But these weren't, of course, enforced strictly for political conventions, and they still aren't.